Let's go ahead and get started downloading our version of Kali and get ready for our system to be set up and configured. Let's do it to it. Now I'm back up on the main download screen, as you can see, and I'm going to be downloading two different versions here. One for VMware Workstation 17, which is what we're going to be using our examples off of, and one for the ISO. We'll be coming back to that in a little bit because I kind of want to go more into the live OS portion of this. But in order for us to do this, we have to click on virtual machine and select which type of virtualization that we're going to be using. Now for this one, I'm going to be using VMware. And you'll notice that there are, let me zoom in here for you, a couple of different links that you have here. First of all, you have the direct download and then the torrent. Now I use direct download because that's just me. And on the right, you'll see some, and this is where our verification for hashing comes into play at, which you will see later in the skill or course for the digital forensics folks. That comes into play to verify that nothing has been tampered with from point A to point B. Now I'm going to go ahead and select on download, and then I'm going to go back to the actual installer, which was up at the top left, and I'm going to select the direct download on the installer as well. Once those two have downloaded, and they may take a minute depending on your connection, you will have one or two files depending on how you want to choose your own adventure through this skill. I have two, and you'll notice that as I zoom in, one is an ISO and the other one is a .7 Zulu file. This is for WinRAR. And inside of there will be all of our VMDK information. Let me move this back over here real quick and close out my WinRAR opening screen and go in, and you'll see that those are all of our VMDK files and everything needed for VMware Workstation. So I'm going to go ahead and extract this inside of a setup folder and get ready for that initial install. As you can see, I've already selected my folder for the extraction inside of WinRAR, and then I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and I'm going to lapse a little bit past this so that way we don't have to wait for the full extraction process. And it's finally completed. So it moved everything over into our new Kali folder, and in order to import this inside of our VM workstation, it's pretty simple. I'm going to take the shortcut to this and just double click the VMX file that came with it, and you'll see that it automatically opens up inside of VMware Workstation. Now, this is a pretty straightforward process of this. We'll be going into a little bit more detail with the live OS here in a little bit, but I wanted to point out to you that there is information on the left side of the screen. Let me zoom in for you right there. And it gives you the username and password on the basic setup, because one thing to note is that this is already fully installed. And once we power on the virtual machine, as we see here, it'll go through its startup process and see that we are already ready to go for our Kali Linux. And this will take us to the initial login screen and allow us to be able to go through and navigate freely inside of the operating system. Note that there are predefined resources for this VM that's already configured inside the VMX file. If you want to allocate more resources based on what your host system is capable of, you are free to be able to go and do that before you actually boot this up. By default, let's go ahead and right click on this and go into settings, and then I'll zoom in for you once that comes up. There we go. By default, the VMX configuration from the installer on the VMware side inside of the download has us go with 2 gigs of RAM, 4 processors, and an 80 gig hard drive. And that's broken up into different segments on the actual file itself. And we'll get more into that here shortly when we do the install from raw and also in the live OS. This is just a straightforward to get us into Kali right away, and the username and password is already provided for us. So let's go ahead and do an install using the ISO in both a true operating system install and a live OS next. If you'll remember, I downloaded the ISO as well, so that way we can do all this, and that was the installer that we got from the actual Kali page. Just note where you actually put it in for folder wise for your access. So when we go into VMware, we're going to click on File and New Virtual Machine. Inside of here, we're going to kind of go step by step in installing the operating system along with configuring it in a virtual machine environment. And we're going to click on Custom. leave it at VM Workstation 17. It will work with prior versions for you out there that have, let's say, 15 or 16 or even older. And we're going to use install. Let me zoom in for you right there real quick. Install disk image ISO. And we're going to browse into our folder where we actually put that ISO at. Now you'll notice I have a bunch of ISOs already for different virtual machines. We're going to double click the ISO, and you'll notice that it could not detect which operating system is in the disk image. That's okay. We're going to specify that as we move on. We're going to list it as a Linux-based operating system and leave it at Ubuntu. Let me zoom in for you right there. And that'll be good enough for Kali to be able to install. The reason we predefined these, let me go back, is because different operating systems interact differently with the host operating system that's running that virtualization for us, whether it be type 1 or type 2 virtualization. And we want to identify that this is a Linux or POSIX-based operating system, so that way there's no interoperability problems as we install the operating system. So we're going to click on Next, and we're going to call this machine Kali-fresh install. And we're going to predefine the folder for it as well. And this folder right here is going to be where all the files are going to be stored at. So that way we don't have loose files everywhere. I'm going to put this in CBT, Digital Forensics, Kali intro, or excuse me, put it in my downloads or my VM folder. And I'm going to make a new folder in there called New Kali. No, I'm going to call it New Kali 2. My bad. That's where the other VM was at, the one we just did. And we're going to click on Next. Now we're going to allocate the different processors to this. Now remember, based on your operating system, and I'm going to show you the task manager from my system real quick. I'm going here and show you the performance tab. Based on the processors available on the host system means that that's what we're able to allocate. We can't go past this right here. That being said, you don't want to allocate all of them because then your host system will be very sluggish because all the resources have been predefined. So this system has 64 gigs of RAM installed on it as well, and we want to make sure that we don't go over that limit because this limit right here, 64 gigs, is a hard limit, but you'll notice that we're already running 45% capacity inside of our memory as well. Now I have another VM running and that's part of it, but just keep that in mind as you allocate resources. So I'm going to give this 2 processors with 2 cores piece, giving us 4 altogether. Next, and then I'm going to allocate 8 gigs of RAM to this particular virtual machine. Next. This point right here is something I really want to point out as well, and is a very good feature inside of Kali once we get to that point, in that identifying different network adapters for the actual operating system. As we are going to leave a default NAT for right now, so we can go out and get updates and make sure that the operating system connects to the network, we can add other virtual NICs to our operating system. And this isn't just inclusive to Kali, it's anywhere inside of virtualization, that we want to be able to have internal or external networks, and how we want to be able to break down port forwarding, or if we want to do NAT and PAT together. Just keep this in mind, but the default is NAT, and we're going to leave it there for right now. We're also going to leave it as the type of hard drive controller for a SCSI controller as LSI logic. Nothing big to change here. We're going to leave it as SCSI. You can actually change this on your own depending on your hardware platform at home. And this is where I was talking about inside of that folder that I'm going to show you here real quick. You'll notice that this version of Kali that we installed a while ago from the that was pre-staged for VMware came in a lot of different VMDK files. And the reason for this is because there's a difference between how we provision the disk. We're going to create a new virtual disk inside of this folder for our virtual machine. We're going to allocate it 100 gigs. And you'll see here, let me zoom in for you, we can either store it as a virtual disk as a single file, one VMDK, or we can split it into multiple files, multiple VMDKs, which is what the image by default had when we downloaded the VMware version from the Kali site. I'm going to store it as one single disk, and I'm also going to allocate the disk space now. If we do this, this will make sure that our hard drive is going to be 100 gigs no matter what, and pre-allocate the space on the hard drive that I'm storing this on. This is the difference between thin and hard provisioning of the actual VM hard drives. And for more information on that, I highly recommend checking out Kelvin here on CBT Nuggets to go more into virtualization. So we're going to store it as a single file and allocate the disk space now. And we're going to browse and make sure that this is stored in the same folder as our virtual machines for Kali. Because by default, it kind of wants to store everything everywhere. And I like keeping everything all together. So we're going to store it in new Kali 2 and save and click on next. And then we have the overview of everything that was pre-configured by us inside of our customization. Now you'll notice there's a customize hardware button. That's something we won't get into right now, but later when we start getting into more specifics with Kali use, we will start to add hardware for us to be able to do some monitoring. We're going to click finish. Now this portion right here is going to take a minute, so you will see me skip past it. And the reason for that is because inside of our new Kali folder, let me open up that right there, go back and open this up. You'll see that it's already starting to provision the actual hard drive itself. So that's the whole entirety of the VMDK file at 100 gigs, and it has to write that to the actual host hard drive. So that's why it may take a second, and if you thin provision, you will see that it takes less time. So let me go back over here and leave it right there, and then I'll be right back after that one completes. And it did complete, and you'll notice that the information box just went away and put our operating system in the list of virtual machines for us. Before I show you where it's at, I do want to show you this folder that's up on the screen right now and zoom in for you and show you what I was talking about with that one VMDK file. That's our hard provisioned hard drive that's already allocated for 100 gigs. So we won't have to go back and make any more files. And if we want to export this, it makes it a little bit easier by decreasing the number of files. So if we look inside of our VMware workstation, we can see that we have a fresh install. And in the next portion of the skill, we are going to go through step by step on the installation process at a core level for Kali instead of having it prepared for us automatically like the VMDK came from off the download side. We've got the basics of our operating system for Kali prepped in VMware for a fresh install. Let's go ahead and walk through step by step the installation process. For that, we'll be inside of our VM workstation, and you'll remember that we have our Kali Fresh Install VM already aligned for us based on the ISO. We're just going to go ahead and fire this one up on power on this virtual machine and wait for it to go through its process. Now, experiences may vary depending on the resources allocated. But as you can see here, we're starting up and we get the beep letting us know that it went through post and it's going through its initial setup. Now I'm going to try to zoom in and out to let us see what's actually going on. And I'm moving up and down real quick because this is timed for default installation. The first thing that we have come up is what type of install are we going to be dealing with? Now I generally go with graphical install to give us the GUI in not only in the installation process, but also in our current and final form of Kali that we'll be examining throughout the rest of this course. So let's go ahead and zoom out real quick and click in there and say graphical install. And again, this may take a few seconds to be able to go through depending on those resources. So you may see me skip a little bit to kill some of the dead time. Speaking of which, and we jumped over to how we want to select the language for our operating system. Now, there are many different languages available. For this, we'll be going with English and hit continue. Based on your location, you want to set this up as well, but we're going to select United States, even though we're in Texas. I hope you get that. And click continue. Keyboard, this depends on what type of system that you're running. This may vary with Mac if you're using that, because I have had to change this a little bit for Mac layouts, and that's something I did in post. So it won't make any difference if you select American English, but that's more with the drivers and things like that and common POSIX-based system drivers. You'll see that it's already detecting the hard drive that we pre-visioned, and is going through and loading the additional components. Now, I will go ahead and skip through this because this takes a second, but compare this to the actual preloading inside of a Windows install as well. And for those, definitely check out Bob and also James here on CBT Nuggets for good Windows installation and security measures. So once we skip through all the basics, and some of those basics include identifying the hardware that's installed on the physical system. In this case, it's a virtual environment. But if we installed it on this laptop right here, it would detect some of those different things like the network interface card and try to assign a IP address based on DHCP. Do remember, this is running off of the ISO as if we were installing on something like this laptop behind me. And that's why we're going through step by step. I also want to point out that this is very similar to our live OS install. Tips for later. We're going to keep the name of this one as Kali. Actually, I'm going to rename this one Kali-Fresh. And the reason for that is because we already have a Kali system on our virtual environment here that is named Kali. And you might see a DNS error on the network when you're monitoring. We're going to continue. Are we associated with a domain? Generally not if you're using Kali, but just on the rare chance that you are, this is where you would put in your information. Go ahead and continue. And now it's going to go ahead and look for username and passwords. In this particular case, we're going to go with the default, which is Kali for our first user that's also going to have admin rights on the system. And username for the actual account is Kali. So if you want to put in a full name in the previous one and Kali on this one is the actual username, that's good. You can hit continue, and this is where we select our actual password. And again, we're going to go with the basic defaults that we get from the actual site when we have a pre-configured Kali box, which is Kali in all lowercase. And you can actually click and see if the password is correct on both sides. We're going to continue. And you're going to set your time. We're in central time and configure the clock. There are different settings you can do inside of virtual machines, such as sync the actual time. And for that, while that's loading, I'm going to show you that real quick. Go into right click the virtual machine, go into settings. And when the settings open up, if we go into our options tab for our VM workstation settings, we can see that there's a tool, and I'm sorry I have to keep zooming in and out because I can't click while I'm zoomed in. We have VMware Tools Time Sync off. That's the default for this virtual machine, and we would want to set that to the actual host time itself. And you can do that by checking the synchronize guest with host, and that will allow the time that's on our host system in type 1 or type 2 virtualization environments to be replicated on the actual virtual machine itself. This is not something you have to restart for, so I'm just going to click OK and go back into our actual installation for Kali. And see here, we're at the partitioning of the actual disk. Now it's looking at the 100 gig VMDK file that we have on our host system that represents a physical hard drive. Here, I want to use the entire disk. If you have any other methods or preferences, you can do that as well. But since I'm not using anything special on this configuration, I'm just going to leave it as the whole disk, and I'm going to select the disk to partition. If there were multiples, I would pick the one I want. But since this is a clean disk, we're going to select the default answers and provision the whole disk as one partition. Now, we're going to keep all the files in one partition instead of separating into, let's say, a operating system and a data partition like we usually do inside of Windows for our installations. This would be the same as if we kept everything on the C drive in Windows. That's what we're going to go with. It's going to go ahead and go to next, and then we're going to verify everything that we've done for the disk partitioning. We're going to keep our settings that we've configured, but one thing I do want to note is, let me zoom in for you real quick, is that we have our hard drive as ext4. I know I've got my mouse cursor right over it. I apologize. But the partitioning for our primary partition that our operating system is on is ext4 and not NTFS or FAT. Might be something you want to keep in mind later if you're trying to examine a piece of information that's coming from one of those different file types or partition types. And click continue, and then we're going to make sure that we are one more time sure that we want to partition this disk. And yes, we are going to write the changes to disk. The default is no, FYI. We're going to continue, and then it's going to take a little bit. So I'll be right back after this for the actual partitioning and writing of data. On this system, this process right here to get to this point took about 8 minutes. I just wanted to give you that heads up. And this is asking us now, what kind of software loadout do we want to do for our individual Kali system? There's one option I want to show you real quick. And let me zoom in for you real quick. You can see that we have desktop environments. So selecting this item has no effect, but the three right below it do, and you can only pick one of those generally. Now, the XFCE is the default environment for our Kali system. In previous courses where you and I have been together and you've seen me use Kali for our demonstrations, that's this environment. You can pick Genome or KDE Plasma for a different operating experience. We are going to stay with the default. And the other options are the basic tools. You can either use the top 10, which fall in the categories that we covered earlier in the skill, or you can do the default recommended tools available in the live system. These tools are the basic loadouts, and again, with the link above, you can see what comes common with Kali, or you can install others through apt-get or apt-install, depending on how you want to do it. So we're just going to leave it as default and hit continue, and this right here is going to take a second as well too, because we're pre-installing all the tools and desktop environment on the actual hard drive. Again, this may take a second. I'll let you know how long it takes on this particular system. This part of the process took about 20 minutes, just FYI. So here we are at installing the Grub boot loader, and this is just making sure that we have a boot sector on the actual hard drive itself to be able to boot inside of Kali Linux. We want to continue with the default yes, because we want to keep everything on the same drive. Here we're going to select the /dev/SDA folder on the actual drive itself. Or if you want to enter it manually, you can as well. And then it's going to install the actual bootloader itself and then start with the finishing of the overall installation. So I'll be right back after this. And we finally reached the end of our installation where we hit continue for a reboot. And it will bring us back into the actual Kali operating system that we know and love. This should look familiar to us as we come back into Kali, because this is what it looked like when we exported the VMDK file and that pre-staged virtual machine of Kali. And as we boot up into the first time use, it'll look very familiar to us. And remember, we set the username and password for this one, along with the basics of where all the folders are. And it's important to note that the reason we do a manual install is to make sure that we're familiar with everything inside of this particular version of Kali that we're operating on.